Our guest today is Nancy Rose. Nancy is an author of a book called Raise the Child You've Got, Not the One You Want. Her subtitle, Why Everyone Thrives When Parents Lead with Acceptance. Leading with acceptance is vital for good parenting. Nancy, tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I grew up as quite the achiever. I was very, very good in school, and this is how I got my approval, is by academic achievement. And I was about 24 years old. I was a tax attorney and a CPA when I say that I awoke from my trance of accomplishment, because it really was like a trance. I had gone my whole life achieving good things, nothing that I regret achieving, but my motivations were to get the approval of my mother. And when I realized that, my life really changed.
So you began to realize that you had a dream of your own.
Well, and it wasn't quite that simple to understand what my dream was for myself, because when you grow up seeking approval, well, I had kind of a troubled childhood. The situation in my family was such that I did not feel seen and accepted for who I was. And what I realized later is that I found my niche in academic achievement. This is where I got my approval from my mother. And of course, academic achievement is a wonderful thing. However, I woke up at age 24 realizing that basically I had become a tax attorney and a CPA in order to impress my mother. And that's not how children should grow up. Children need to understand who they are and follow the dream that speaks to them. And although becoming a tax attorney and a CPA was a wonderful accomplishment, and I don't regret it, it certainly didn't speak to who I was as an individual and what my hopes and dreams were. I say that I awoke from my trance of accomplishment and realized that I didn't really know who I was.
You wrote a book because of your own life experience. You wrote a book to touch other people's lives and to teach parenting to mothers so that they would understand that your child can go further and be happier in life if they realize who they personally are and if that is acceptable.
That's right. The book has its beginnings in my own experience, but it's not a memoir of any sort. I start and end the book with my own experience to sort of frame the importance, the message that I'm sharing, which is that children need to be seen and accepted for who they are. And when they are, they shine. When they are, they grow up to be comfortable in their own skin. And they grow up giving back to the world their own unique light. It's really a very simple proposition. The flip side of it is that when children are not seen and accepted for who they are, they begin to hide pieces of who they are. For example, if a parent does not like the fact that a child is loud and, say, bossy, stop being so bossy and can't you just be quiet? These are traits the child may have been born with. And when a parent disapproves, that child will feel wrong for being basically who they are. And they'll try to tuck that away. They'll try not to be bossy. They'll try not to be loud. But you know, it's inevitably that's a battle that can't be won because everyone needs to be who they are.
Can parents guide that child in a way or a place where being bossy and loud is exactly appropriate?
Well, that is just a brilliant question, and that gets to the gist of my message, that when parents accept their children for who they are, then they are in a position to guide that child to become the best version of who they are. So they now have the opportunity to take this child who has gifts. Being bossy is really the same thing as being a leader. This is a child who wants to lead, but without parental guidance on the proper way to lead, on the proper way to share your ideas in the world and not bulldoze over everyone. Without that parental guidance, this child will not maximize their gifts. They won't grow up to be a leader. They'll grow up to alienate people, a loud and bossy person who likes that.
Unless they're a coach on a dangerous sporting expedition, then they're the blue winning coach.
True. However, that loud and bossy person who has been taught to channel their leadership constructively and positively, to use their loud voice constructively, is the person who really gives back to this world. I'm not advocating unconditional acceptance of a child's behavior. That is absolutely almost the opposite of what I'm advocating. I am advocating that parents understand and accept the things about their child that the child can't change. And when you accept those essential elements of who the child is, I call that the core self. When you accept your child's core self, then you are in a position to influence their behavior. And absolutely, parents must influence their child's behavior. It's a parent's job to teach their children what is proper and what is not proper in the world, in our family, in our community, in the world.
Nancy, you tell us that there are 9 traits that make up a person's core self. Explain them.
The 9 traits of the core self are adapted from the research work of the psychologists Thomas and Chess, who did a groundbreaking study about the nature of personality. This started back in the 50s, and they followed children and measured their traits over a long period of time to try to determine which traits are innate, in other words, you're born with them, and which traits develop later. And they studied this across cultures. And what they found is there are 9 traits that children are born with. And I've adapted those traits to what I call the core self. And the 9 traits are as follows. And the first trait is activity. Everyone who's a parent knows that a child is born either active or not as active. And the activity level is the amount of movement engaged in by a child over time. We're not talking about 1 hour period. We're talking about over time. So you have a very, very active child. You might be calling them hyper. You might be calling them crazy. You might be calling them ADD. But their activity level is a trait that is set at birth. Adaptability is the second of the 9 traits of the core self. And adaptability refers to the flexibility or resistance that a child has to changes in routines and plans. As you know, one child will be what you call a go-with-the-flow kind of kid. You can take them to Europe in a backpack, and they're happy. They're with mom and dad, and they just adapt. Another kind of child with low adaptability needs to know what the plans are and does not appreciate changes in plans. And I have a funny example from my own parenting experience. When my sons were about 4 and 8, we decided they were old enough to appreciate Hawaii. And so we took them to the Big Island, and we rented a beautiful home where we had to drive to the beach. So the first day, we drove to the nearby beach, and we had a lovely day. The second day, as we got ready to leave for the beach, we decided we would go to another beach because there are so many in Hawaii. And my older son, who has very low adaptability, could not, for the life of him, understand why we would go to a different beach. He had been to a beach that he loved, and why wouldn't we go to the same beach every single day of our trip? But this is a perfect example of low adaptability. The third of the 9 traits of the core self is distractibility. Oh, let me define distractibility. Is the ability to tune out outside interruptions or stimulation. So a child with high distractibility is very much interrupted by what's going on in their environment, and they see something else. It's like the next shiny object, oh, look at that. That's a highly distractible child. A child with low distractibility can sit and focus and not even hear, dinner's ready. They have low distractibility. Now, as I talk about these 9 traits, this is a good time to point out what you're probably already noticing, which is that there is no good or bad level of any trait. Every level of each of the 9 traits has challenges attached to it and opportunities attached to it as well. It's all on how we look at it. It's the language we use and the frame of reference that we use. The next trait is, this is a big one for understanding children, ease with the unfamiliar. And as we know, babies are born either very comfortable with new people, places, and experiences, or they are much more reserved about new interactions, new people, new places. And one child will only want to be with his mother. In fact, not even wanting to be held by the father for a period of time. That's a phase, usually. Another child will go with anyone, is happy with anyone. This is ease with the unfamiliar. So there are challenges and opportunities attached to intensity, just like there are with all the traits. Let me give you an example. Billy is a low-intensity child. What is a challenge associated with that? Well, he can seem to be unmoved. He can seem to be sluggish in responding. He can seem to be not real connected at times. That might be a challenge associated with low intensity. But what is an opportunity associated with low intensity? Well, a low intensity child is a very self-contained child, a child who can sit perhaps and read for hours at a time and sit quietly when needed. In the classroom, low-intensity children are very valued. Well, it depends on what kind of school they're at. But in mainstream education, it's the low-intensity child who is composed and quiet and can sit for long periods of time that is valued. Now, the high-intensity child who is loud and is a child who's going to be noticed. That's an opportunity in life. When you have the high intensity, I'm a high intensity person, and I am spreading this message. I am of acceptance for children, and I am out there, and I'm getting noticed for that because of the conviction and the passion and the intensity in my personality and my message. Now, if I were a low-intensity person, I would be doing this differently, obviously. But this is an opportunity in my high intensity. What's a challenge in my high intensity, or anyone's high intensity? You can be accused of crying wolf a lot. And you see this in kids. It's like, come on, do you have to make a big deal about everything? And parents get very exasperated by this. And you know what? Yeah, I do need to make a big deal about everything, but teach me how to make a big deal about everything so that I'm not annoying to other people. Accept my level of intensity and value it, and then guide me to be a high-intensity person who is effective in the world. The next of the 9 traits of the core self is optimism. Some people just see the sunny side of life. They wake up every morning, they're raring to go, and everything's great. It's not that they refuse to see the negative. Their temperament is such that they are going to see the positive. They're an optimist. Now, a person with low optimism, and I purposely framed it this way so that you don't call someone with low optimism negative, because that's a judgment that children don't need to have put on them. If you have low optimism, you are pretty much the voice of reason, the devil's advocate. You might see things a little more pessimistically, yes, but there is great value in that as well. And the world needs both kinds of individuals. This optimism level is something that tends to really trigger parents. If a parent is a high optimism individual who just sees the world is great and has a low optimism son or daughter, oh boy, this can be such a point of conflict. I call this a hot spot. It's the hot spots in parent-child relationships where a parent's level of a trait and a child's level of a trait are either too similar or they're too different. And the different levels of optimism can be a huge trigger. Why can't you just, Now think back to when you were a child and what it felt like to hear that. I was one of 5 children. I was the squeaky wheel. I was the one who spoke up. When you hear, why can't you just be like the others, or why do you have to be so negative? As a child, you can't answer that question. You don't know, hey, this is just who I am, and this is a valuable part of me. You don't know that yet. And so what this does is this creates shame. You don't have an answer for the question, but you know it's not okay to be how you are and who you are. It's a judgment, and it's a judgment that gets internalized very young, very early on in life. And the earlier these judgments get internalized, the harder they are to let go of. And in fact, a child who is told, why do you have to be like that? And tries to suppress being like that, tries to be more positive, tries to be something that they're not. Over time, they begin to lose touch with that piece of themselves. They really try to suppress it. And with certain traits, they may be pretty successful in hiding those pieces of themselves, even from themselves, consciously.
So Nancy, what do you do with that child? Do you actually help them get analytical and find out why they feel the way they feel, and give them a path to search what they're saying and the validity of that, and lead them into finding out whatever makes them believe that that's just not okay, and let them follow that? Is that what you do?
Well, in a sense, yes, because what I advocate is for parents to follow the steps that I outline in my book, which are the path to acceptance. And as the parent starts along this path and follows these very concrete steps to understanding who their child is, that's the first step. Then they can open up the dialogue with the child to say, you know what? I'm realizing now that it seems like I'm criticizing you for something that you don't deserve to be criticized for being loud or for being so intense or high maintenance. All these words I've been using, that's not fair. I'm starting to understand that this is a part of who you are. And just because I'm different, that doesn't make you wrong. And I'm starting to maybe think that I've been telling you that you're wrong. And you know what? You're not. Now, imagine as a child having your parent come to you and say, you know what? I'm starting to look at things a little differently. And I think maybe I haven't been quite fair with you about, imagine. I mean, when I speak to groups of parents, I ask them to think back on their childhood and imagine getting this message from their own parents. And it's an emotional reaction. It hits people right here. And they say things like, wow, that would have made such a difference. I had a story in the book about a woman who felt like such an outcast in her family. You know, she was a real spitfire, and she saw rules as something to be challenged. Now, this is a trait, but her family, both her parents and her siblings were all the opposite. They felt rules are to be respected, and boom, 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 you go along, and you don't push the envelope. Okay? So Kathy grew up feeling very alienated in her own family, and she left at age 18. And she actually is close to her family now, but she went for many, many years alienated from her family. And I asked her, Kathy, what would it have been like? Would things have been different if your mom or your dad had said to you, you know, Kathy, I'm starting to understand something. I want to ask you something. I realize that we're different from you, but that doesn't make you wrong. And you know what? I value that independent streak in you. I value your courage and your desire to just push the envelope. But you live in this family, and as long as I'm your mother, I need to give you rules and guidelines about, you know, the proper behavior that you need to have. But that way, when you go out into the world, you're going to be very well prepared to be someone who is a dreamer and someone who pushes the envelope. What I asked Kathy, which is, would things have been different for you? And she teared up. And she said, oh yeah. She said, I wouldn't have felt like such a misfit. And that word, misfit, is so poignant, because really what it is a misfit. But it's a misfit between two people whose trait levels are different. That's all. One is not right and one is not wrong. So the rest of the traits are persistence, regularity, and sensory reactivity. And briefly, persistence pretty much is what you think it is. It's that stick-to-itiveness in the face of challenge. Okay? Now, distractibility and persistence can be confused sometimes, because distractibility means focus on something. So a child may be low distractibility, where they really can focus on something. But they also might be low persistence, because if a challenge comes in, they're off doing something else. Persistence is the ability to stick to it when there are challenges. Parents want their children to be more persistent. Of course, you want your children to be more persistent in schoolwork, in projects, in sticking to things for the long term. Do you really want your child to be more persistent in begging you for cookies, in insisting that they want to stay up late for a movie, in wanting to see an R-rated movie? you're asking them to change their level of persistence, and they can't do that. They are who they are. So if you have a low persistence child, value that and teach them how to stick to a project. Teach them the importance of sticking with something even in the face of challenge, even though that doesn't come naturally. And how do you teach that? Well, you model it, and you model it in a warm, connected parent-child relationship so that the child wants to emulate you. Okay. The next trait I said was regularity, and again, children are born with a certain need for a regular schedule or not. And this, again, can be a great source of conflict between parent and child. A parent who is a highly regular individual or a highly regular family where everyone goes to bed at the same time has a son or daughter who has very low need for regularity and wants to stay up until, late at night being creative or whatever. Boom, hot spot. If you don't understand that this is in your child's nature, it's not something that you can discipline them to understand. A child with a high need for regularity is absolutely triggered when the parents don't provide that structure of that regularity for them. And yes, absolutely, it creates great anxiety. And so you're not meeting your child's needs if you're not aware of the fact that, Trevor needs regular naps. Trevor needs meals at regular intervals. And I need to provide that for him so that he is optimized, so that he's not full of anxiety all the time, even though I'm not someone who is like that. The last trait is sensory reactivity, and that refers to the extent to which you're bothered by external stimuli, the senses, basically, clothing that bothers you, or you're terribly bothered by noise, or very sensitive to light. And there's a whole developing body of work around sensory reactivity. They call it a certain syndrome now, which I'm not sure I like, labeling it with a syndrome. This is a problem for many kids because they're highly sensory reactive, and it requires a lot on the part of the parents to help them. Because the second part of my message about leading with acceptance being the first step, the starting point in the parenting. The second part is leadership. You can accept who your children are, but will you raise a well-adjusted child if you just accept? No. You need to also be a leader, and parents must be the leaders in the family so that they can guide the child's behavior, so that they can optimize who that child is.